Coming up, finally the Tories were booted out of office after 14 years of corruption, incompetence, Brexit, culture wars and government purely in the interests of the powerful and wealthy. Whatever followed had to be an improvement. So Keir Starmer's Labour Party was the only realistic alternative government given our electoral system. Starmer, the radical Labour leadership candidate of 2020, had embraced Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto and pledged to stand by it after his appointment. But once he became Labour leader, Starmer began breaking his promises. It's true, he took a badly defeated Labour and transformed it into an election-winning party, all in a surprisingly short time. And I understood the point made by Starmer's supporters that to do this, he had to not frighten the horses with radical policies. The oft-repeated analogy was that of the Ming vase strategy, holding on tight and making sure he didn't drop it as he crossed the ice rink of the 2024 general election campaign. But now, Starmer sits as Prime Minister in the House of Commons with a working majority of 167 seats, and he still clutches the Ming vase so tightly it really doesn't feel like a reforming radical Labour government in any way, shape or form. Stay tuned. Free broadband, free adult learning, free dental care, the biggest council house building programme in decades, abolition of student tuition fees and restoration of maintenance grants, all paid for by squeezing the rich, raising corporation tax, making tech giants pay the exchequer a fair whack, and by borrowing more, much like the successful reinvention of the country by Clement Attlee's government after the Second World War. That was the Labour Manifesto that Starmer inherited. Fast forward 4 short years, and the Starmer government seems a million miles away from that radical agenda. 2 months into our new government, there are positives. The batshit Rwanda scheme was immediately consigned to the dustbin of history. No more talk of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Some restrictions on arms sales to the Netanyahu regime in Israel. Not enough, but a step in the right direction. A swift and effective response to the Farage riots on our streets. Settling long-running industrial disputes with rail workers and doctors. But there are other areas where Labour have been a huge disappointment. The two-child cap. 2 weeks after Labour's victory in the general election, Keir Starmer told Laura Kuenssberg from the Tory wing of the BBC that Labour was not changing the Tory policy regarding the two-child limit for child tax credit or universal credit. A Scottish National Party amendment in Parliament would have ended this policy, but Starmer whipped Labour MPs to vote against the SNP amendment. 7 Labour rebels then had the whip suspended for 6 months, during which time they sit as independent MPs. An early sign of the disappointment at Starmer's lack of radical ambition. Back when he was running to be Labour leader, Starmer tweeted, "It's time to scrap universal credit," following up with, "We must scrap the inhuman work capability assessments and private provision of disability assessments, scrap punitive sanctions," and here it is in black and white, two-child limit and benefits cap. Starmer's backsliding was opposed by many Labour MPs, the Greens, Plaid and the SNP, and Suella Braverman, who spoke in the Commons saying, "I believe that the cap is aggravating child poverty and it is time for it to go." A bizarro universe where Suella Braverman would appear to be to the left of Keir Starmer, at least on this issue. Brexit. Prior to the election, many people hoped that Starmer's Brexity stance against rejoining the EU was just part of his Ming vase strategy to keep the Red Wall Labour voters on board. The very day before the election, he said that the UK will not rejoin either the EU, the single market or the customs union within his lifetime. The softening of the mood music since the election, with his visits to the leaders of France and Germany, is a welcome sign that the hostilities maintained by the Tories for years have now ceased. But it seems that Starmer's pledge on not rejoining the EU in his lifetime really does mean that Labour won't seek meaningfully closer relations with Europe for as long as he is Prime Minister. One of the most worrying signs of Starmer's commitment to Brexit has been his party's policy on special economic zones, the SEZs. These include charter cities and the like, and are known as extraterritorial islands because they're outside of the usual taxation and regulatory regimes. They've been promoted by the likes of Margaret Thatcher and more recently Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. SEZs are particularly attractive to right-wing libertarian thinking because of their lack of protections for workers or the environment and circumvention of government regulation and normal policing. Private SEZs are not allowed within the European Union, and the fact that Starmer's government is said to be considering up to 74 of them, from Plymouth in the southwest of England right up to Cromarty Firth in Scotland, on 25-year contracts, makes rejoining the EU impossible. I'll be covering SEZs in a lot more detail in a forthcoming video. Abolishing the House of Lords. Back in November 2022, Starmer vowed to abolish the House of Lords to restore trust in politics. Fast forward to today, and the much watered down plan for House of Lords reform will amount to no more than a tinkering at the edges, with a gradual phase out of most, but perhaps not all, hereditary peers. I personally think it's an outrage that in the 21st century we should have members of the legislature who are only there by dint of whose penis half their DNA happened to spurt out of, rather than by election or on merit. That includes, amongst others, Oswald Mosley's great-grandson, Lord Ravensdale. Also, of the 92 remaining hereditary peers, every single one of them is male. That can't be right. And when they're eventually all gone, it will still leave the UK's House of Lords as the second largest legislative body in the world after the National People's Congress of China, with more unelected bureaucrats remaining than there are MPs in the elected European Parliament. So much for unelected bureaucrats. Labour has also promised to introduce a retirement age of 80 for members of the Lords, but says that move will follow later after consultation. Don't hold your breath. The winter fuel allowance. As Starmer and his Chancellor Rachel Reeves talk up the significance of the unexpected £22 billion annual overspend black hole left by the Tories, rather than look to those with the broadest shoulders to raise more tax revenue, this so-called left-wing party decided instead to pick the pockets of the elderly by removing the non-means-tested £300 winter fuel allowance. Now, I know there are many wealthy pensioners who don't need the money. I mean, Richard Branson is one of many wealthy pensioners eligible for the payment. But to remove it from all pensioners above the universal credit threshold just seems a bit harsh. The threshold could have been set a little higher. But it's the process as much as anything that's so disappointing. The first port of call to fill a financial black hole, and Labour looked to pensioners. That's what I find so disappointing. And with 53 Labour MPs abstaining, the biggest rebellion yet for Starmer, this has to have been the stupidest decision yet by the new government, wasting so much political capital for just a few £billion. Trivial in the grand scheme of things. More was saved by scrapping the Rwanda scheme, for example, just to put that saving into perspective. The £28 billion per annum Green Prosperity Plan. Labour's original Green Prosperity Plan, pledged in 2022, would have seen the party pump £28 billion a year into the green economy, right up until 2030. Starmer referred at the time to our climate investment pledge that invests £28 billion a year to help us win the race for the next generation of jobs. But it's since been watered down. Instead, Labour will ramp up to that figure by the end of 2026, according to Chancellor Rachel Reeves, saying it was no longer feasible as the Conservatives have crashed the economy. Labour insists it's not binned the plans entirely, but the U-turn still represents tens of billions of pounds less in investment in the country's future. Public services in public hands. Another of Keir Starmer's leadership pledges back in 2020 was that public services should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders, pledging to support common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water, end outsourcing in our NHS, local government and justice system. But yet again, we see some rollback on these promises. In March, Rachel Reeves confirmed the policy had been all but scrapped, with only rail now still marked for nationalisation. And in May, Starmer suggested a massive move forward on water quality could be made without nationalisation, saying, "I think with stronger regulation, stronger enforcement of regulation and accountability at the top of the water companies, we can make a massive move forward on this." So, despite a massive landslide majority in the House of Commons and a honeymoon period where they've been enjoying the broad support of The Sun, The Times and other traditional foes in the media and in business, what we've seen so far from this government is a weak, disappointing Labour administration, bereft of courage and adopting many of the flawed Tory fiscal rules that economists like the phenomenal Richard Murphy have been debunking. I spend a lot of my life arguing with people who lazily state that all politicians are the same, trying to bring a bit more nuance to the lazy both cheeks of the same arse debate. I reject these simplistic arguments 100%, but boy, Starmer and his cabinet are not making that task any easier right now. I've covered just a few of Labour's policy reversals and dilutions in this video, but what do you think have been the most glaring Labour letdowns so far? And what would you point to as being the positives? Leave a comment below and don't forget to give this video a like and share a link on your social media. Maybe also check if you've subscribed and have clicked the notifications bell, as 2/3 of regular viewers haven't yet done so. Thanks for watching. See you next week.